Um, One of the fundamental points about the New York Times is there is a complete separation of editorial control, um, um, which exists in the newsroom from the business of the New York Times, let alone its shareholders. And no shareholder has any influence on the coverage of the New York Times whatsoever. Carlos Slim, in particular, I just want to say, has been a very loyal shareholder of the Times, has never asked me or anyone else to change the coverage that we do in any way at all. And I often say to colleagues and friends in Mexico, I'm the chief executive of the New York Times. I'm not allowed to influence the editorial coverage of the paper. Sure. So over the last 10 years especially, there's been a transformation in the way we do journalism at the New York Times. We have lots of platforms. Our physical newspaper, the print platform, is an important platform. But the most important platform we've got is the smartphone, and the second most important is the laptop. And of the 130, 140 million people who come to us every month, the overwhelming majority will never, ever look at a physical paper. And so it's smartphone first. It's heavily reliant still on the written word, but it also involves video, virtual reality, augmented reality. Podcasting is very important to us. Animating infographics to explain the news is important to us. And there are many, many other new innovations in storytelling we're using. So we can present the news in the most compelling way. And when we think about the one thing we've got to get right, the first thing always now is how we look on smartphone. I have to say, some of the bravest and best journalists I've ever met are Mexican journalists working in this country right now. It can be very tough and very dangerous being a journalist in Mexico, especially if you're an investigative journalist. And I take off my hat to the courage of my colleagues here, who not just for the New York Times, but working for Mexican publications, who risk their lives to report what's actually happening in this country. And what I want to say is that if we can help using our news resources to report events in Mexico, I think that's to the good. But there's no substitute for having a really strong indigenous journalism. And I think for Mexico, as I feel for many, many countries around the world, it's really urgent that the country understands that a free press is good for a country. It helps people understand what's actually going on. It makes politicians and others accountable. It helps in the fight against organized crime. And in many, many ways, it helps make society better. One of the tragedies of what's happening around the world at the moment is many countries that fight for a free press and for free expression is not going well. It's going backwards. I do think that the arrival of Donald Trump and of a kind of populist leader, a non-politician in the White House, has required some new approaches in journalism. I mean, we have, for example, many more investigative journalists in Washington than we've had in our history, because there are so many things we don't yet understand about Mr. Trump, about his campaign, and about how he's currently working in office, and we're having to do more digging than we would have done in the past. We're also, I think, out even more than before, out across the country, trying to report what's happening in America and trying to understand how American politics as a whole is changing manifestly. It was a dramatic and unexpected moment when a majority of Americans voted for Trump. And again, we're trying to get under the skin of that and try and work out whether this is likely to be a permanent change in American politics or temporary. And lastly, I'd say another really interesting and intriguing set of stories, the relationship between America and its allies and its neighbors, in particular its closest neighbor, Canada, and especially Mexico. And it's amazing how often the issue of American-Mexican relations, about what's going to happen to those relations in trade, in the issues of immigration, in the issues of law enforcement and drugs and many other things, are coming to the fore. So, yeah, of course, having a completely different kind of leader in America means that we've got to think about how we do our coverage differently. But the basic principle of the coverage, which is that we try and report the truth without fear or favor, absolutely remains. And to that extent, our values and our standards are exactly the same with Mr. Donald Trump as they have been with every previous president. One striking thing about the present moment in journalism is, to an extraordinary extent, there's a kind of debate about what's true and what isn't true. Um, uh, Lots of completely false stories are published routinely um, on the internet, either by individual crazy people or actually by foreign governments or other really malign forces who want to distort the truth for their own ends. And I mean, my view is that what professional journalists do and great news organizations like the New York Times is stand up for the kind of journalism we believe in, where we don't think everything's an opinion. We believe there are facts which you can go out and find out and report. And in everything we do, in every story we post on the internet, in every page we print in our newspaper, it's clear to our readers that we have really tried to find out the truth, and we're accountable. We're accountable. If you think what we've printed or published is not true, tell us and we'll change it. And so I think there is a battle going on between truth and falsehood. And one of the problems is not just the people coming up with the false stories, but the fact that very eminent, powerful people now often say that they believe the false story rather than the true one. And the president, in particular, President Trump, has got a habit of retweeting entirely false things on the internet. We happen to know this because some of the false things he's retweeted or indeed tweeted himself are about the New York Times itself. He said that our subscriptions were going down, our audiences were collapsing, and these things simply aren't true. The opposite is true. We're seeing the greatest growth in subscriptions and audience we've ever seen. But it's a strange moment when you have to go onto social media to contradict the President of the United States because he's spreading lies.